I extend a warm welcome to you viewers. This is the second lecture in the series on Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. We have so far discussed women's fiction in the 19th century. Today we would look at Emily Bronte, the writer and the woman. So it's going to be a kind of a brief biographical sketch of the woman, what she was like, what kind of a home she had, what kind of an upbringing she had, what were the things that were important to her, what kind of a person she was. All those questions that you might have before you approach a text, we would try to discuss them today and pick up some details from Emily Bronte's life. To begin then, Emily Bronte was born at Taunton, Yorkshire, and in 1820 her family moved to Haworth. Now Haworth is this little town which is along the moors, so you find moorlands spread out in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. So you can imagine that she has taken those depictions and those descriptions from her life situations. So Hawthorne was this little town along the moors, and which actually inspired all the Bronte sisters when they were writing their pieces, whether it was Charlotte Bronte or Emily Bronte, or for that matter the youngest Anne Bronte. So these sisters looked at the moor and tried to inculcate the place that they were living in, and they tried to bring it to their own works. This kind of a surrounding actually fueled their imagination. So Taunton and Haworth, specifically, these were important, for Emily Bronte's projection, or the projections that she used in Wuthering Heights. As far as her life is concerned, Emily's life, that was nothing less than tragic in that sense, because Emily lost her mother when she was barely 3 years old. So she was born in 1818, and in 1820 they moved to Haworth, and by 1821 you find that her mother passes away of cancer. And her father and aunt, that is the maternal aunt, really took care of the children. Now that is the first part of her, of the tragedy, really, when she lost her mother when she was very young. In fact, this goes parallel with Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and who too lost her mother very early on in life. And there's a kind of a absence of the mother, and this kind of an absence of this kind of maternal warmth that you can already see in their works, whether it be Frankenstein or Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. So in a way, there is a kind of an absent maternal feeling that is there both in Emily Bronte and Mary Shelley. But that was just a kind of an aside. To return to Emily Bronte's life, she lost her mother very early on in life, and her father and her aunt took care of the children. Now, father was a clergyman. Emily's father was a clergyman, and therefore she was able to study for a brief period of time in this clergyman's school, which was basically the clergyman's daughter's schools, and she studied there from 1824 to 25. But for the rest, Emily Bronte was actually largely educated at home by her father and aunt. And the girls liked to read a lot, and therefore they soon evolved a literary sensibility. Now 1835 is when Emily accompanies, so her schooling is done, homeschooling is done, and by 1835 there are already young women who are approaching the world at this moment. And Charlotte, her elder, who goes to teach at a school in East Yorkshire, and this is where Emily accompanies her in 1835. But she doesn't like the place or the discipline that this kind of school had, and she felt homesick and returned to Haworth. Then, a couple of years down the line, she actually took up a job of a school governess at Law Hill near Halifax, which was again a hilly district. And again, the places that Emily Bronte visits during her formative years and stays there, these somehow make way into Wuthering Heights, her only novel. It is actually believed that the place was the chief inspiration, that is Halifax, right, the hilly district that we were talking about, where she took up a job of the governess. It is believed that this place was the chief inspiration for Wuthering Heights. There was a manor house near the school where she was teaching, which was called the High Sunderland Hall, and it is thought by some scholars that this was the model she used for Heathcliff's wild moorland house in Wuthering Heights, which had this kind of grotesque sort of exterior and this kind of a overwhelming sort of a picture that it became, right at the top of a moor. So this is the kind of a place that scholars have found that probably this school, this house, this manor house near the school gave inspiration to Emily Bronte to project it as Heathcliff's house. So, well, these are of course conjectures, and a lot of study has been done on these. In fact, there is a scholar named William Sharp who in 1904 brought out this book which was titled Literary Geographies. Now in this book, he would show photographs of these places, pictures of these places that were used in novels, and he again the geography of the place again has become an interest to the scholars. There is in fact what we call today the Bronte country. Now here again you find that scholars are constantly looking back at the surroundings of Emily Bronte and trying to find in those surroundings that she saw or she grew up in the roots or the first sort of pictures of Wuthering Heights. That is now in itself a kind of a scholastic enterprise in itself. That was 1835, her brief stint with Charlotte, then 1837 or 38 when she took up the job of a governess. But then by 1848, the sisters, both Emily and Charlotte, they decided to open their own school at Haworth, and they were very excited about their plans, and for that they went for a year or so to Brussels to study the languages, basically French and German, and Emily was able to gain mastery over French there. She wrote several essays in French which have now been made available to us, and I'll probably we have this when we are discussing her thematic concerns, I'll also touch upon an essay that she wrote in French actually, just to tell you a sense of, or give you a sense of the person that she was. But 1848 is when they are really excited about this plan of opening their own school in their home, and they go to excel in languages that they don't know, so they study the languages and they excel and come back from there. Of course, we find that the plan didn't see fruition because there weren't enough students in the remote area that they lived in, and that plan could not be a success. And yet these kind of escapades and these kind of journeys that they make into different places, these in a way reflect on the mental makeup of the person, but also find some sort of a relevance when we are discussing the novel Wuthering Heights. So Emily's sisters, really speaking, Charlotte and Anne, both of them were also prolific writers, and as from their very young age, all of them would sit together and on a table at the table and write poems and prose pieces, and they also liked to sketch. Emily particularly liked to sketch, and if you just go around and research, you would find this kind of a beautiful sort of sketch that she's made of her dog Keeper, and she liked to sketch. All of them did, along with their brother Branwell. So it was almost like a house where they were breathing literature, because they were writing stories, building their own imaginary lands, and come up with new sort of places that were all seated in their minds, because remember, as women they weren't moving out too much, and but they had some sort of freedom to go and become a governess or a teacher, but then largely they weren't moving in the literary circles of the time. In fact, not many people even knew about them. So by 1846, in fact, the three sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, as I told you, they were all writing their own novels, they were also writing poetry. So they together decide to publish a collection of poems, and this was titled Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. Now you might have noticed that why are these poems titled Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell? It is because none of these sisters wanted to publish under their own name. Even when they got a publisher and they were paid a royalty, even then they wanted to keep their names male. And remember, I spoke to you about male pseudonyms also. So they used their initials, poems by Currer for Charlotte, Ellis for Emily, and Acton for Anne, and Bell is for Bronte, right? So they're using the initials, but they're actually using male names because they don't want to receive censure, and they don't want to come out in the open that these are women who are writing. These were their respective, therefore, pseudonyms, and these poems that they wrote, most of them, especially Anne and Emily, they were very close as sisters, and they made their own world, and their own world, a kingdom called Gondal in the Pacific. They named it Gondal, and then they started writing about this kingdom and this imaginary land that they built, and there were wars there, etc. So poems were written on their imaginary land. So you can see this kind of a fertile imagination that these young girls had, and they liked to express themselves through literature. It was the pastime that they indulged in, and were constantly guided and inspired by one another. And so you find Charlotte Bronte wrote the famous Jane Eyre, and Emily Bronte again writes Wuthering Heights. That's her only novel, in fact. And Anne Bronte, in fact, published her novel Agnes Grey with Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights in 1847, but of course it was milder and gentle as compared to Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights had all these violent passions, and it was it had a crime scene. It had it was kind of a dark sort of a novel, but Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey was that way milder and did not receive that kind of praise that Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights received. In fact, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights was seen as being, people didn't believe even later. You see, it was in 1850 edition or so that Wuthering Heights was actually published under her name. Till that time, it was considered that, a male writer had written it, because people couldn't associate this kind of a dark romance that she wrote to be coming from a woman's pen, because women were supposed to be gentle. But it was as if all the violent passions that lay seated in her mind and heart, they found way in her literature or in her novel. So so in a way, 19th century women's literature also brings one very important fact to the fore, that there was much that was dark and sinister, and they had such kind of virulent passions and intensity of experience that one otherwise did not expect from women of that time, or rather male writers did not give scope to that kind of passion of women that they were able to project in their own works. Particularly the Bronte sisters, it's like a kind of a family genius. Again, I'm reminded of Mary Shelley, who also had on one hand Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and then at least the legacy was there, and then being married to P.B. Shelley. So it's almost like family genius sitting together. Again, in the case of the Bronte sister, it's more like a kind of a family identity that they are building of the Brontes. We often refer to them as the Brontes novels, because they seem to have this kind of an underlying dark passion that otherwise does not get reflected in the writings of male authors, for instance, right? So returning to Emily's life, I said that she had there were a lot of tragic experiences that she had. First, she lost her mother when she was barely 2-3 years old, and then you find that Emily lost her siblings. Emily also in fact succumbed to tuberculosis at the age of 30 in 1848. In fact, 1847 is when she's able to publish Wuthering Heights, and just in a year's time she dies in 1848. Now, the interesting thing is that Emily saw a lot of these deaths in her own house, and so death is a kind of a prominent theme in her novel as well. You find that the two oldest Bronte sisters, so having lost her mother when she was just a child, she also loses very soon her elder sisters, right? So you find that the oldest Bronte sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, they too died in 1825. Now this is the period when Emily was in the school, remember, the clergyman's daughter school, and in fact this clergyman's daughter school became a kind of a model for Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where she talks about the Lowood school, because the conditions there were pathetic, and they felt it was a kind of a bleak school, and that they felt abused there, and that they didn't like it at all, and it was a kind of a disease or a kind of an epidemic that school sort of saw the wave of, and which took in its wave both Maria and Elizabeth. So you find that this kind of series of these diseases taking over women very young on in life, and so their life expectancy in that sense is very low. And if you read some of the diary entries of Emily Bronte, you would find that she often notes that I don't know where would we be after 5 years or so, because if all is well, then perhaps we'd be at this place. So suggesting that there is always this kind of an apprehension and a sort of a doubt vis-a-vis whether they'd be able to even make it to adulthood, and whether they'd be able to live a life that they visualize. So there is a sense of urgency that is there in the writings of Emily Bronte, that it is in the here and now that she's writing and she's projecting herself, because there is a kind of uncertainty with life and with this kind of close proximity to death that you find in her works. Again, this kind of close proximity to death is something that you also find in the American poet Emily Dickinson, again 19th century woman poet. So in America, that is, but here in England too, this kind of a life which is unpredictable, which is uncertain, is constantly looming large, and seems to have made a kind of a dent on the psyche of the writer also. So you find that the oldest sisters, in that sense, the Bronte sisters, both Elizabeth and Maria, they die in 1825. They were barely aged 11 and 10 at that time, and Charlotte was the family survivor in that sense, because Charlotte, the family survivor, actually died at 38, and after mourning the deaths of Emily 30 and her brother Branwell at 31, and Anne, who was only 29. So it's almost like this entire family had been wiped out, and in a way it's a kind of she actually brings out their works of her sisters, particularly Emily. She wrote the preface also for her works, because it's in a way she was trying to secure a family legacy, because all of them had died and she was the only one who was trying to keep alive the memory of the family and the works that they had written. So so many deaths in the family, one after the other, made also Emily this kind of a character who was in a way sometimes also almost obsessed with death. So it is worth noting that the characters in Wuthering Heights also die very young. Think of Catherine Earnshaw. Now she dies when she's barely 18. Hindley, he dies at 27. Isabella dies at 31. Linton Heathcliff at 17. And Edgar at 39. Heathcliff himself is probably just about 37. So and when the book actually ends, you have these Hareton and Catherine who were supposed to get married, but again they're like 24 and 18. So the kind of expectancy of life is not much, and Emily Bronte is aware of that fact, and she's aware of this kind of impending death, so to speak, in her own life. And when she projects it in literature, when she projects it in her novel Wuthering Heights, there too you find that characters have a very short span of time that they spend, and the rest of it is their memory and the role of memory played by them, and the tortuous sort of memory that it becomes for others. So and leading to a kind of state of anxiety and frustration. All of that is also comes from Emily's own life, because You see, Emily was a very private person, and she was mostly, she would be secluded in that sense. So seclusion was very dear to her, and yet people she loved, she could, you know, sacrifice her life for them, and they were very dear to her. So you find that all her you know, sisters who died before her, and the death of her mother in a way left a void in her, and she was, because she was not a sort of a social person, therefore she had to turn to herself each time for sustenance and repose. So it was a kind of a kind of a turmoil that she had to deal with deaths in the family. So you find that death becomes a kind of a central theme also in Wuthering Heights, and it is an important part of Emily's own mental makeup. You find also in Emily Bronte, along with this, because of the seclusion that I talked about, and the intense loneliness that she you know, that she experienced. Also, you remember when so her mother dies, but also her aunt, who had been taking care of the family, she too you know, passes away, and Emily you know, then takes over the household and does all the chores of the household. And it is that time when she also becomes close to Branwell, and has taken up the domestic duties in the house. Now the point is that there is this kind of intense loneliness and intense suffering that she is not able to express otherwise. The deaths of her mother, of her sisters, of her aunt who was living with them. So all these in a way created this kind of impression on her and left her desolate often. And you can see this kind of seclusion and this kind of intense loneliness in the characters in the novel also. In fact, all characters seem to be in a way cut off from other characters. So there is a kind of a inability to build very strong ties, except for ones that have already been made. So except for ties such as between Catherine and Heathcliff, which have almost surpassed this kind of physical world and entered a sort of a transcendental world, except for those, it is very difficult to build relations in the physical material world. In fact, it's almost like Emily wanted to surpass the physical and material world, which was very harsh on her because of the deaths of her dear ones, that she actually built a sort of a relationship, trans-material, or you could say transcendental, mystical sort of relationship with people she had lost. And you know, she's able to carry on in memory and the relations that she's able to build in the spiritual world of hers, where she's not tied down by material life and its you know, harsh ways. So loneliness, intensity of experience, seclusion, these are the words that you associate with Emily Bronte. Unlike Charlotte Bronte, her sister, who was still able to sort of make peace with her life and have a kind of to meet society also and its ways, which Emily could not. Emily would rather stay in the enclosures of her own world than go out and you know, adjust in the social world. It's interesting really that the moorlands that in a way surrounded their home, in a way became this kind of a fence, in a way became this kind of the bridging gap between society and their own lives. And Emily was very happy with her own home, the space of her home and the wild moors that surrounded it, and which was an extension of her home. So the moorlands, you know, and the wild moors that you see in Wuthering Heights, they are a part of Emily's growing up years. In fact, you know, the wild moors of Yorkshire, where she grew up, and the idea of home, they are inseparable, because for Emily Bronte, the house extended into the moorland, and in a way, if you look at it from another point of view, then this was all that she knew of home. So you know, it's a kind of a desolate place, the moors, where you know, they're rugged and it's desolate, and yet it is her home, it is her turf, right? So she wouldn't exchange it with anything else, and she doesn't try to enter society, she doesn't want society to enter her life. So there is that kind of a boundary that she creates around her as a person, and that also gets reflected in the novel, where you only see this kind of an isolated place where, you know, and Heathcliff living there, right? So that way, you know, it's almost like rejecting social norms or society, and accepting or preferring the the warmth of the home and the wildness of nature. Now, the wildness of nature also in a way reflects her own wild spirit. Now, if you look at some of the biographers, etc., we are often told that, she was a shy girl. Emily was a shy girl, and yet, she was as wild and free. Her spirit was wild and free. So, in a way, she lived her life inside her head, and there was this kind of wildness about her that again draws meaning from the wildness of the moors, right? The greens which are natural. Again, this brings us to the debate of social and natural also. When people would tell her that, maybe you should dress up in a particular manner, then Emily Bronte would say, I wouldn't, because that's how God created me. So the adherence to the natural, and the natural as the beautiful, is something that comes in time and again in Bronte's sisters' works, you notice. So the wild, free spirit of Emily Bronte is something that you find also in the novels. It's as if characters are ready to explode, so in a way they are intense characters who suffer, as Emily would suffer herself, but don't express them in as many words. They are living away from society, and yet they prize that wildness and that freedom that they are able to exercise, living in the wild, in the lap of wild nature. So nature is again an important theme in Emily Bronte's work, and also this comes from her years spent in Yorkshire moors. Now, one more thing that I'd like to add to this, that nature gets extended to include the beasts and the birds of nature. So Emily actually had a very intense relationship with the birds and the beasts around her, and she would be seen with stray dogs, and she would have conversations with her own dog, and she was very fond of him. So she was always uncomfortable in a kind of a disciplined social space, and preferred to be with these animals and birds all the time, or her own home. So this was her area of comfort, and this was her space or her home, you could say. She was often seen even in the biographies of Charlotte's, we are given that she was a frail girl in that sense, and a timid girl, etc., while physically speaking. But there are also now instances that we know of where she is seen as a courageous person, right? So she had the courage of this kind of a courage of steel, in fact, where she could stand up for what she liked, despite being this frail girl that otherwise people supposed her to be. She was also very self-critical, and she judged herself often harshly, which she didn't do with those she loved. In fact, she would give them the benefit of doubt, but often judge herself harshly. So you note a sense of self-criticism in her works as well, and in her own ponderings, in her own thought processes, as she would write them in her diaries or in the essays that have been preserved now from her works. And you find, therefore, on one hand there is this kind of a superficial or external sort of timidity and frailty which people associate with her, but there is this kind of a inner worldly, violent passions, and this kind of steely courage, and this kind of obsession with her with nature also, and or this kind of obsessive compulsive love also that she imagines and writes about in the novel Wuthering Heights. So in a way, and she's able to explore, what is interesting is that she's able to enter human minds and look at them critically and see there the root of a particular emotion or root of a particular feeling. So she's able to not only talk about, as a young girl really, she's also able to see that there are dark passions and there is mystery of nature, and that there is violence as well in life and destruction that takes place, along with all the softer and tender feelings that women were otherwise supposed to harbor. So while she is able to talk about the softer, tender feelings, she is equally adept at talking about and writing about the violent passions that exist in human beings. And this is what you find in Wuthering Heights as well. Finally, I'll just quote from this essay of her, which I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion. This is from the essay that she actually wrote in French. It is titled Butterfly. And here in this essay, she is talking about basically how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, and she is she actually also talks about how she squashes or under her foot this worm, and she thinks that this is destroying the leaves before she realizes that it actually leads to a kind of a butterfly. So that's the kind of a note on which she's talking about. But I'd like to end our discussion with this particular quote from her essay Butterfly, where she's talking about, where she's pondering over and contemplating and talking to herself about the idea of nature, of creation, of human mind, etc. Let me quote that for you. She says, and I quote, "All creation is equally mad. Behold those flies playing above the brook, the swallows and the fish diminish their number every minute. These will become in their turn the prey of some tyrant of the air or water, and man, for his amusement or his needs, will kill their murderers. Nature is an inexplicable problem. It exists on a principle of destruction. Every being must be the tireless instrument of death to others, or itself must cease to live. Yet nonetheless, we celebrate the day of our birth and we praise God for having entered such a world." End quote. If you notice, she is going back to her themes of death, right, and destruction, and she says that nature is an inexplicable problem. It's not as easy. This is not nature that you see. Nature is very difficult to understand and very difficult to explain, and that, she says, nature exists on the principle of destruction. Now that's a very different view of nature that you and I otherwise have. We seem to associate with nature a sense of calm or repose or sense of rejuvenation. Here she says nature exists on the principle of destruction. So her view is very different, and she thinks of everybody mad trying to kill one another, and there's a kind of a circle or a vicious cycle of killing that happens, and one gives death to the other, one kills the other. It's almost like a cycle that takes place, and yet we are foolish. Are we foolish to celebrate the day of our birth? We all celebrate our birthdays. So in a way, you can see this kind of melancholic, morose sort of a feeling in her, but also the violent nature. She's talking about murderers, and she's talking about destruction and death, and attributing these qualities to nature as if it is natural. So it becomes a very problematic. It becomes problematic in itself, and which is why this novel also became very problematic to deal with for literary critics, because they didn't know how to handle such a text where it was it had such intensity and it was seen as natural. So all that had been accepted so far and all the values in society had been turned upside down in the novel because of her sheer sense of rationale that she's able to provide along with her descriptions and characters. So this was just to give you a sort of an overview of Emily Bronte, the writer and woman, and when we meet next time, we'll discuss the text itself, Wuthering Heights. For now, that's all from my end.